Hi everyone, I'm Craig with Chicago Color Label, and today we're going to go over some of the training we typically cover with new customers who purchase a new Memjet printer from us. We offer this free training so you don't have to stumble through the learning process of figuring out what all of the individual settings in the driver do and how to accomplish some very basic tasks that are very easily explained through a brief training with one of our technical experts. These are not plug-and-play devices. These printers do require an understanding of how most of the driver's settings work so you can get the optimal usage and results out of these printers. So the topics we're going to cover today are the same exact three topics we cover with every single customer we do this training for. Topic 1 will be creating new label sizes. Number 2 will be covering in detail some of the individual sections such as the general, media, color adjustment, and import-export tabs. And then finally, number 3 will be some tips on accessing and using your printer's toolbox features to access some advanced settings and features, some of which can be accessed through the printer's control panel and some others that are hidden settings that can only be available and accessed through the toolbox interface. So we've got the Hungry Pup label here, and you know, looking at this label, I have actually this guilty memory that I thought maybe I'd get off my chest. And so when, my niece was young, she's a young lady now, she's about in her 20s, but when she was about 5 years old, I grabbed some kibble out of the dog's bowl, and I told her it was snack mix, and she really likes snack mix, and so she took a piece and she ate it. So I feel really bad about that. So anyway, on with the training. Here's the Hungry Pup label, and we're gonna go over this label throughout the training. So here we go. What we first like to do, if you don't already know the exact dimensions of the label that you're printing, I like to go into an application here and go to the properties and find the actual reported page size here for the label. So in this case, we have a label of 5.05 by 3.8. Okay, so remember those numbers. We're going to write those down and we're going to use those later. And then go ahead and navigate to File and Print as if we're going to print this file. We're not going to actually print it, but this is how we get into some of the settings. And through this particular application, these windows might look a little different, but almost all of them, if not every single one, will have a Properties button if you have the correct printer selected here. So in this case, we're going to select the Afinia L801. And the Properties button here is how we get into all of those settings that we just discussed. Before we go there, I want you to look over here and notice that we have a document size of 5.1 by 3.8. Now this is the application's way of just rounding up. So that 5.05 I gave you, this will not give you 2 decimal points, so it just rounds up to 5.1. This isn't actually correct. We're 5.05, but again, it is rounding up. And then we have 3.8, which is the correct size because that's the actual, it's the actual dimension of the height of this label. But you notice that the paper type or paper size is 11 inches wide by 8.5 inches high, which is not correct, and that's represented by this black border here. So we're going to correct that right now by going into the properties, and this is a step you're going to have to only do once for each new label size that you want to print. So if we look down at the bottom here, we see the size is 8 by 11, which is echoed here up at the top of the page. So what we want to do for this is set up a new label size. We're going to click the button Custom Sizes. And in the media name here, this is nothing more than whatever you want this label to be referred to by. Some people choose a customer name if they're printing a particular label for a specific customer. Some will select a product name if they're printing specific product on this size. Most people select or type in the label size in this, as that's a little more indicative of what they're going to print. And then down here under size, we're going to put in the actual size. So this always has to match the actual label size here, no matter what you put up in the media name field. And for this, we have selected inches, and we're going to go ahead and click Save. And you'll notice that the value then pre-populates down here in the size field. So if we click OK and then OK again, you notice that this changes. Now this orientation is not correct, so for this particular label, I'm going to select Portrait. Now we have a label that matches the paper type. So if we see the document is 5.1 by 3.8 and our paper is 5.1 by 3.8. So this is a perfect match. So document always represents the artwork and the paper represents the label size. And keep that in mind. So with that, we're going to go back into properties and we're going to cover some of these other sections here that are really important. So we're going to work our way up in the list here and we're going to go to media type. If we select this drop down, we see 5 different media types: plain paper, glossy paper, matte coated, premium matte coated, and premium glossy. Now, even though these dictate generally or seem to dictate a media type that should be loaded, this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to select one of these to match the media type you have in the printer. What these typically are color profiles. So each one of these is going to lay down more or less ink depending on which one you select. What I like to do for all labels I create, I usually start off with matte coated media as my jumping off point. You can select any number of these that work for you. What we generally recommend is that when printing a new label, you maybe print a few copies of each of these and then go to your ink cost calculator, which I'll show you later. Go to your ink cost calculator and you kind of identify which one of these labels produced the best result for the least amount of ink. And that can really be then the selection that you use going forward. But for this tutorial, we're going to select matte coated label. Now, if we go up a little more, copies is self-explanatory. There's nothing really to focus on there, and these other settings are not something that we typically cover. If we go up to orientation, again, this is not something we typically cover because the settings that are in here from for the default settings usually are the correct settings. Now, we did have a case here just a moment ago where you saw that I selected a different orientation, but that is not common. And then the page management section here, again, is not something that we typically focus on because it is not generally needed. I have never changed these settings ever. That's not to say that you won't have to at some point, but it's not something that we focus on because they aren't settings that I have ever had to use, nor have any of my customers ever had to use. Print speed down here is also self-explanatory. These printers print at a minimum of 6 inches per second, which is very, very fast. You can go up to as high as 12 inches per second on this particular printer. Now, 6 inches per second, honestly, is more than adequate for anything I've ever done. If you do need to go up to the higher setting here, just note that your resolution will drop a bit on, I believe, the horizontal resolution for these labels. Now, sometimes that's negligible and you don't see any change, but you do want to keep that in mind when adjusting up to 12 inches per second, that you are not going to get optimal resolution out of this design if you are using the higher speed settings. So for this, we're going to select 6 and leave it at that. We're moving on now to the media tab. So if we look at the media tab, we're again going to work our way from the bottom up. So from the bottom, we see page cutting. And we're going to cover these options here. Where these are important are how the printer prints the labels and presents them to you. When using print and present, what that's going to do is print any number of labels that you select for your copies, but it's going to wait for you to pull a label off of the printer before it prints the next. So where this might be helpful is where you have a print and apply line where somebody is standing there at the printer, pulling a label off, applying it to a product, and so on and so forth. So if you are printing 500 labels, you are going to have to pull each label off the printer until the next label prints. For most people, this is not an optimal workflow, and they use one of the next 3 options below. So the most common probably is leave first label blank here. So if there are 50 copies printed, your first copy will be blank, and the reason it does that is because the printer likes to use that first label to dial in the gap or black mark settings for that label. So when you are printing gap or black mark, it is using that first label to kind of adjust things just right to get that design printed in the right location on the printer. Many times I find that that first label is okay, and I don't mind wasting the ink on that first label if it's going to be right. In many cases I find that that first label prints just fine, so I find that this setting works really well for most of the situations I'm faced with. The last option here is multiple job queue. So what this really means is if you are printing multiple designs on the same size label and you don't want there to be a cut or a break between those print jobs, you can select this option and it will keep all of those print jobs on a single roll. So if you are printing 100 labels of the Hungry Pup label we see here, and we're printing another 100 labels of a completely different design, but on the same label media, you can select this option. So the first labels will print, wait for you to print the second design, and it will print that second design, leaving both of those designs on one single stretch of label media. Moving up to the media layout section, we have some selections here for inner label gap, black mark, and continuous. The printer has two different ways of detecting the start and stop of your labels. The first is inner label gap, and what that basically means is you have a die cut label where the waste matrix is removed from the outside of that die cut label, which exposes a small section or sliver of opaque, waxy backing. And the inner label gap sensor shines a light from the bottom of the printer up to a receiving eye, and when it passes that opaque, waxy surface, the light is able to pass through, and the receiving eye sees that that light is there and says that is the beginning or start or stop, of a label. So inner label gap is for gap media only. Black mark media is generally used for material where the matrix is left on. The reason matrix is generally left on is for full bleed labels. When you are applying ink all the way to the edge, so you do not have a design with any white border, such as this Hungry Pup label here, there's going to be ink sprayed all the way to the edge so that you don't have a detectable white edge. It's just color all the way to the edge. You do need black mark because there's no longer a gap when you're leaving the waste matrix on. So black mark, there's actually a black triangle printed on the back of the media, and this setting engages the black mark sensor. Continuous media is typically used for customers that have finishers, so they're printing on a sheet of media and they are cutting those labels out with a finisher. Most of our customers are going to be using one of these two settings, but continuous is important for folks using a finisher that are creating their own label sizes. This is the setting you'll want to use. And if we move up finally to this last section up here, position adjustments are referring to the fine-tuned left and right and up and down adjustments of the design on the media. So you'll notice in this representation here, you have a label coming off a printer and it looks upside down because that's how your labels will print when you print them. They will print upside down. So moving something to the left is actually moving it to the right when you're looking at that label correctly. But as it comes off the printer, we want to think in terms of left and right this way. So if you do need to adjust these, your horizontal offsets, you would go into the negative for a left adjustment, a positive for a right adjustment, and for vertical, you'd go negative for an up adjustment, moving that design toward the printer, and a plus adjustment for moving it away from the printer. So this is very, very important for full bleed, people running full bleed labels. Not so much for non-full bleed, although that will come into effect too if you do want to get an exact placement of that design on the label. So what we typically recommend is for customers to print 2 or 3 labels, see where it sits, make adjustments accordingly, and your adjustments are going to be quite small. So you're going to be somewhere in the ballpark of 0.03 or 0.04 to start. And then you adjust from there. After you get your 2 or 3 labels, you see roughly how much you want to adjust. You create those adjustments here. You print another few labels and keep going until you've got that just right. So let's move on to the color adjustment tab. Color adjustment tab allows you to make some, as it says, color adjustments. Now I tend to feel that this is a bit like swatting a fly with a hammer. I think if you do have to make color adjustments, that it's best to make those in the artwork. But if you do want to make them here, you can select these check boxes. Sliding to the right increases the amount of each of these colors, and sliding to the left decreases the amount of each of these colors. So you can play around with these, print some copies, come back, adjust some more until you get the correct settings in place. Again, we like to make the artwork adjustments here as opposed to adjusting these, but it's good to know these are here in case you need to make some quick adjustments to the artwork. Moving on to import export. The sole purpose of this is to export a file of your media sizes. So in a case where you are uninstalling your driver or changing PCs where you will be printing from, instead of having to set up all of your custom sizes all over again, you can do an export first. You export that to a file, put it on a disk drive, on a thumb drive, and then from the new PC that you're using to print, you can use the import function to bring those sizes back in. And by doing that, you can avoid setting up all these custom sizes. Some customers have hundreds of different sizes in here potentially, and that is a big job to have to re-enter those all by hand. So the import-export function gives you a quick and easy way to export those and re-import them so you're not having to manually set them up every time. So we're moving on now to part 2 of the training, and part 2 takes us into the toolbox of the printer. So these are kind of behind the scenes settings. It's some of the settings that you can access from the front panel of the printer. There are also some settings in here that you can access from the driver settings, and there's some additional settings that aren't accessible any other place than in this interface. So to reach this interface, we're going to go ahead and find the Afinia folder or the VIP folder or whatever make and model that you are printing with. The toolbox is pretty universal for all of these printers, but you're going to look for this little gear icon here, followed by the make and model name, and then followed by the word toolbox in most cases. So this link right here will get you to the screen you see presented here. If you do not find that link, or you cannot access it for some reason, you can simply go to the following IP and port name. If you type in 127.0.0.1:8080, you can access the page this way as well. So either of those ways works fine. This will pull up the interface for you. We're going to go ahead and switch back to the original screen that we had open before. Every once in a while you'll notice the logo doesn't appear here, some various other little quirks with this page, but that really doesn't matter. These are not required for usage of the page, so we'll not worry about those. The printer status page is what's presented to you first when loading this page. And this page includes some very basic information about the printer model, the firmware version, a serial number, the date it was originally installed, and so forth. So a lot of miscellaneous information here that you can gather by just visiting this single page. The other information I want to cover here that's accessible without logging in first. There is a login available here, but we're going to just cover the pages that are available to us without a login. This ink level page is very, very useful. And not just this area here for ink level, which is also echoed on the front panel of the printer, but down here on the ink costs and ink usage section. So the idea here is that you can submit through this option here the cost per liter of the ink you're using. So for the L801, the cost per liter is $900. And if we hit submit on this, any print jobs that have been sent to the printer will be saved in this box here, and their cost per nanoliter for each color used. Actually, this is nanoliter, the amount of ink usage right here in nanoliters. The cost of that label total for all of those colors added together is displayed here in this column. So for this particular label, that was 216 millimeters by 280 millimeters, which I'm not sure exactly how that measures out in inches. But for this label, whatever this design was, is going to cost us 16 cents. So it's probably a pretty big label with full coverage for a cost like that. But this is an incredibly useful tool for pricing out your labels, especially if you are producing labels for other customers. So when deciding how much you're going to charge for that label, this is the first place that you would start. You would print a few of those copies of that label, and you would come back here to see what these costs are, and then add in your media costs per label, and you have your all-in cost, at least for printing and consumables. You will have your all-in cost for what that label costs. So incredibly helpful here. If we go to local settings on the left, these are some basic settings again. Some of the things that are available through the front panel of your printer. LCD contrast, brightness, we have label gap sensor sensitivity and black mark sensor sensitivity. So if you are finding that the printer is having difficulty sensing that gap or sensing that black mark, you can increase or decrease the sensitivity here. And Afinia Support or Chicago Color Label are able to guide you on the best setting to use here if you notice that you do have issues with the gap or black mark sensor. And then down below here for page cutting, we have very similar settings to what you've already been shown on the driver page. We don't typically like to set these here. I prefer to do that configuration in the driver as you were shown in the last few minutes of this video. So now we're going to go ahead and click on Login. And the login here is defaulting to admin automatically for you. The password for this on every Memjet printer that we're aware of is going to be 123. Submit that, and we're now taken back to the printer status page. We've already gone over this, and we want to cover some of the more advanced settings here. So if we go to security setup, we do see that you can change a password here for the printer, so that 123 can be changed. Security level on the printer is quite important. If you do embark on, let's say, a wiper roller replacement, there is a setting that only reveals itself on the front panel that you will need. It's only available under the highest admin control of the printer. So you can set that from the front panel again, or you can set it here. Either way, it accomplishes the same thing, and in the case I mentioned, it makes the service station ejectable on the printer, which is required for changing the wiper roller on the L701, L801, and most, if not all, of the VIP printers. So moving along here to network setup, this is quite simple screen here. You can change the printer name. These are network settings here that maybe your network administrator will want to change. Going under Diagnostics, this is a screen that gives us, again, very similar settings to what the driver provided you in the previous section of the video. So you can set continuous gap or black mark here to be the default setting. So if something is not selected in the driver settings, or something is, you're sending a print job to the printer in another way that circumvents the driver, this setting would be the one that would take control in those cases. Some sensor threshold values, these should only be adjusted if Afinia Support or Chicago Color Label Support is getting involved with some issues that you're having. Typically, we'll avoid using this. Override auto sensor threshold, again, the same thing. And then there's a couple of test pages here. Again, you can print these from the front panel, or if you feel more comfortable going to the toolbox here and printing them, you can select these to print to the printer by clicking on one of these. Moving on to advanced settings in the upper right corner of the screen. So advanced settings 1, we've got two different pages here of advanced settings. Advanced settings 1, the only place we like to cover on this. Everything else is a bit more detailed than we need to get. So when you are printing a large print job, there is an interval within that print job where the printer will want to stop what it's doing, stop printing, and service that print head to keep it healthy. This setting is set for 6 minutes currently, and that is the default setting. We don't recommend changing this unless Chicago Color Label Support or Afinia Support instructs you to do so. But this is what controls how often the mid-job servicing level occurs when you are printing a big print job. Moving down to keep unused print head nozzle wet settings. This is known as the KWS setting. It's been referred to as the keep wet setting or the keep wet spitting. I prefer keep wet setting. Keep wet spitting sounds kind of gross. What this is the printer's attempt at keeping unused nozzles hydrated when they aren't being used. So an example of this is if you look at a label that's being printed with a lot of white space and look at it very, very closely with the naked eye or magnifying glass or a loop or something of that nature, you will notice a very, very faint, fine dot pattern being sprayed onto that white area of the label where there is no other graphics or text being printed. So that is the KWS setting, keeping those unused nozzles hydrated, because there are several thousands of nozzles that probably are not getting used when there is a large section of a label that you aren't printing on. Now, this usually isn't an issue. Every once in a while I get a question that says, why are there little dots on my label? And the first thing I think is, you must have very good eyesight. And the second thing is, I recommend that they go in and they change this setting. However, this is the biggest caveat I can mention on this. If you do disable this or set it to a lower setting, always make sure you go in and reset this back to the automatic or the high or something of that. You probably want to avoid low. So one of these two settings. I think high is a bit much. You might see that dot pattern a little more pronounced. But make sure you go in, and if you did disable it or set it to low, you do not keep it at that setting, because it will reduce the lifespan of your printhead. That is very important to mention. You do not want to leave this setting off or on low. It's so important that you keep this setting in place. The last thing I'll cover here is under other settings. And the setting here for retract the label out of the printer if idle for 30 minutes or whatever setting, 10 minutes, 30 minutes. We always disable this on our printer. What this is going to do is, if you are not using the printer, any labels loaded into the printer will be ejected. They'll be unrolled or rewound out of the printer. And when you come back to print a label the next time, you're going to have to reload that printer. The reason this setting is here is for what I have been told is for if you are running media, for example, in a very high humid environment, that label rolled into under the rocker arm of the unwinder into the printer path, that curl can be remembered in the media, and you can get jamming of the media. So in that case, you would want to make sure you retract the media every so often. The first thing we do when we get a new printer in the office, in the showroom, we unselect this. We do not want our labels rewound every 30 minutes. We've found that we don't have any negative impact from unselecting this and having the labels loaded in the printer 24/7. So moving on to advanced settings 2 over on the left here. So the only option we cover here is this first option that says, in pause, print a label every X seconds. And we have several options here, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, all the way up to 180 seconds. Where we find this useful is if you do purchase a rewinder. That rewinder takes a while to load, especially when you're new to using it. Now, what typically you're going to do is you're going to print a large number of labels that need to be rewound, say 1,000 labels. You're going to print only a very small section of that, maybe the first 5 or 10, maybe 4 feet of labels, and that will give you enough lead to load onto the rewinder. However, if the printer is printing at 6 inches per second, that gives you no time at all to load the paper path of the rewinder before more labels are pouring out and really complicating the situation. So what you're typically going to do is print that stretch of labels and hit pause on the printer. Now, when you're paused on one of these Memjet printers, with all Memjet printers except for the L901, if you're paused, that printhead is going to be exposed to the air. And the printer does not want that printhead exposed to the air for very long because the nozzles dry out very quickly. So in this case, in pause, print a label every 30 seconds. Even though your printer is paused, it is going to print a label every 30 seconds. So As you're loading that rewinder and you've got that stretch of labels and you don't want to be interrupted, especially when you're new to loading that rewinder and you're learning it for the first time, you can come in here and set a very long pause interval. And this longest interval here of 180 seconds should give you plenty of time to load that paper onto that rewinder without getting interrupted with one label printing every so often. Now, we only recommend that you keep this set at this high or somewhere in this ballpark here while you're getting used to loading that rewinder. Once you become comfortable, you'll be able to do it very, very quickly, and you can set this back down to a lower setting. So really only use these options here while you are learning to use that rewinder, and then set it back to one of the default settings here. The 10 seconds is probably very good, or maybe 20. All of these other settings here, if we page down, again, are more advanced settings. They may be touched on if you ever call in for support, but more so than not, these are not going to be very important to you, at least for day-to-day usage. We're now going to go into import-export settings, and this is the final stop. So this is pretty self-explanatory. If you do have to factory reset that printer because of an issue, this is always a good place to go to do an export of the configuration of the printer. We'll export everything that we've seen here and more to a file, and when that printer is reset, you can quickly come back in and import those settings that you saved. And that concludes our Memjet driver training. Thanks for watching. Please remember, if you do have any questions about any of the content in this video, reach out to us by phone or email shown here. Please like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.